Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, just over 1 week remains to June, the first deadline for the U.S. government to raise the debt ceiling, which is currently at $31.38 trillion. If the debt ceiling is not increased, the government will not be able to continue paying its bills. The debt ceiling debate has become synonymous with wrangling between Democrats and Republicans and seeing which concessions can be received. Republicans want to use the crisis to get the Democrats to cut back on spending. Democrats say it's not the right time for that as the country is facing a crisis. In the middle of all this, it's the people who are on edge and wondering what is really going on. Well, I'd like to welcome my guests to this program. Help me look at all of this. Out of Atlanta, Paul Craig Roberts, Chairman of the Institute for Political Economy and former Assistant Secretary of U.S. Treasury. And out of Washington, Marcia Baker, economic expert, EIR, I believe. Thank you both for being with me. Good to see you. Paul, what is going on? Let's talk about this debt ceiling. Let's simplify it. I mean, for those of us with not strong economic background, what is going on here?
Typically, the two parties jockey over what spending can be cut. The Republicans have their favorite slate of spending cuts, and the Democrats have their own. And normally it goes right down to the wire and some agreement is made. It's never failed in the past, even though the media pays a huge amount of attention to it. It is possible that something else could be going on this time. I've noticed over recent years a tendency on the part of some Western governments for the executive to bypass the legislature. We saw that recently in France, where the French president simply removed the issue of raising the pension age from the legislature and raised it by edict. Mm-hmm. We've seen similar edicts on the part of George W. Bush and Obama in suspending civil liberties. And this is sort of a growing trend that's gradually accumulating power in the executive. Now, if an agreement is not reached, and if Biden refuses any sort of accommodation with the Republicans, it would be on purpose that an agreement is not reached. But Biden can simply then declare a national emergency and raise the limit by himself. There's really nothing to stop him from doing that. And it could well be that this is part of some program of further eroding powers of legislatures in the Western countries and further putting them into the hands of the executive.
Interesting. Well, Marcia, what does it mean when the U.S. government debt of $31.38 trillion is about 22% more than the value of all goods and services that will be produced in the U.S. economy this year?
Well, first, let me just endorse what the speaker just said about the, so to speak, politics, if we're moving to edicts, government by edicts. But in your question, what does it mean? It would be very bad to have a shock of interruption to functioning of debt offerings, public debt. But let me not go into scenarios, but instead say that this kind of impasse we're seeing of discussions of whether to agree on a debt ceiling level represents a generalized incompetence in the leadership layer, because our dollar system and our domestic economy, and we can talk internationally as well, is really in breakdown. You know that the degree of lending is shrinking for in the general commercial economy, for housing, for businesses, for small businesses. You've seen 4 banks, regional banks, fail. There has been a removal of deposits in our banking system in the United States of $1 trillion within the last year. And this kind of withdrawal of funds is going on, $12 billion first quarter this year. So there are interruptions and breakdown. And whether Republican or Democrat, this is not being faced with a few exceptions. Speaking of Congress, where the action is, and there's some talk with President Biden, as you know, there are moves to look more seriously at the economy. Do you know there's a reintroduction of what's called the Glass-Steagall law from the 1930s that operated for 60 years that would help re-regulate banks so you could have credit to restore production. But so far it's rear guard.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. They're talking about restoring that after so much theft has taken place and so many businesses, unfortunately, have gone down. Well, Paul, I mean, U.S. President Joe Biden says America is not a deadbeat nation. We pay our bills. How true is this reality? I mean, because the U.S. gets away with a lot because, of course, the dollar so far is still the global currency, although definitely diminishing fast. I mean, tell me what that has meant for the United States to be able to do what it does.
Being the world currency means that everyone else pays your bills. You see, if you are the world currency and your currency is used to settle international transactions by the rest of the world, there's a huge demand for your dollars, for your currency. In this case, the US dollar. And this demand for dollars absorbs all of the debt that results from the United States trade deficit and the United States budget deficit, because the foreign central banks are willing to hold their surplus dollars in the form of US Treasury bonds. So being the world reserve currency, it means you don't have to pay your bills, or that you pay them by printing money, because the rest of the world uses your currency to settle its international transactions, and therefore the world's central banks hold the dollars in the form of U.S. Treasury debt. And so financing the American debt has never been a problem since the dollar became the world reserve currency after World War II. And this is often overlooked by the debates in the Congress about debt and so on. When the debt becomes a problem is, as you noted, when the dollar loses its reserve currency role, which recent American policies are causing to happen, such as the Russian sanctions, the Iranian sanctions, the seizure of the Russian central bank reserves. These are convincing other countries that it's risky to hold onto dollars because you can be sanctioned that way. And so we see increasingly countries settling their international transactions in currencies other than the dollar. And this is what is the threat, not so much the American debt, but the fact that it's losing the ability to have the rest of the world finance its debt, because it's driving people away from the use of the dollar as world reserve currency.
Well, what about that, Marcia? I mean, in so many ways, it seems like the United States is just shooting itself in the foot. On the other hand, they're making a big deal about the debt ceiling crisis that, as Paul said, at the end of the day, they're going to increase they will increase it as they always have. On the other hand, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of attention to the fact of that the dollar is falling fast and the effect that that will have overall on the United States and American lifestyles.
You're quite right. Things are moving steadily along. There are central banks in the world getting out of the dollar and buying quite a bit of gold. It's not as if it's dramatic or overnight, but this process where we see China, India, and Russia discussing a potential new system for exchange of currencies for trade to replace the SWIFT system of the West. All of these things are moving along. And there is a blank out as well as a blackout in some of the current office holders of the United States on this, but it's definitely happening. Plus, I could add the war economy effect, that syndrome, where, for example, in all the wrangling over the debt ceiling in Congress and with the White House, there has been agreement not to touch the $870 billion US fiscal year 2023 military budget. So if you put war expenditures in the transatlantic, in Europe as well as here in the US, on top of a decreasing activity in the real economy, industry, agriculture, infrastructure, this is a very grim picture. It could be reversed, but it's headed towards worse and real crisis.
Well, Marcia talked about the war economy. I want to talk about that a little bit, Paul, because on the one hand, the government says it may run out of money, but on the other hand, there is always money for war and the war machine. And even in the middle of this so-called crisis, we see the billions are steadily going to the war effort in Ukraine. I mean, what does it all mean, Paul?
Well, the President Dwight Eisenhower warned the country in 1961 in his last public address as a two-term president about the military security complex. He said that we had not disarmed after World War II because of the Cold War, and we had watched the military industrial complex, is what he called it at the time. We still had industry in those days, was gaining so much power that it might become a threat to democracy. And of course, they have. They have enormous campaign contribution funds. If you go against their budget, you will be cut off from funding. Your opponent will get the funding. It's a very dangerous and risky thing for any member of the House or Senate to cut the military budget. And even the Democrats who claim they want to do it, they won't really do it. It's their response to the Republicans who always want to cut the social spending. So I think that on the whole, the situation is sort of understandable, and the only real ingredient I already mentioned, it may well be that this is a opportunity that the executive branch will use for Biden to give an order that the debt ceiling is raised. That would be the most unique feature about the current controversy.
Okay, well, Marcia, I mean, there are those critics who say this whole crisis situation dealing with the debt ceiling is manufactured in the way the attention is brought to it, and basically trying to reflect or deflect from something else, other things that are happening in the society, or perhaps, as we've already talked about, the fall of the dollar, or the fall in general of the power of the hegemon. I mean, what's your perspective on that side of things?
Well, I agree with you. You put your finger on it, the way there are manufactured issues in the U.S. media. My fellow panelist was talking about the military-industrial complex, and really you have a military-industrial academic media complex, and keep going. They are saying that, whereas for many Americans, they are seeing in their localities and their states, very drastic social and economic breakdown examples. 63 rural hospitals are on the brink of shutting down right now around, especially the farm states. You have the suicide rate among youth, and by the way, among farmers. I just mentioned farmers. You have more homelessness, suburban housing crisis. You have the end of the public health special program for COVID-19 that was announced a week ago by the federal government. So no more special kind of help for food aid, housing aid, hospital aid. And this is all going on when your television is telling you you must follow, like a sports event, what's going to happen with the debt ceiling. So there's a disconnect there. It's going to get more and more. And I think some of the demonstrations, as your program just mentioned, the Belgian workers are in the streets. You've had farmers demonstrate in Europe. And here in the US, the growing dissatisfaction with the rubber stamp, very dangerous, continued military support for Ukraine is not just an economic issue, it's becoming repugnant. And so that's the real background that's taking place behind the apparent issue of the debt ceiling debate.
Well, Paul, I mean, in the middle of this that we've talked about as far as reactions from the Republicans or the Democrats, and basically they're going to go after their interests and make sure they stay in office. In the middle of this, the American people who are suffering, really suffering, now, as Marcia's just pointed out, various issues as far as pointing towards deterioration of overall lifestyle. What is it going to take? She also mentioned about demonstrations in Belgium and other countries. But in general, the American populace may hear and may say they understand what is going on, but at the end of the day, it seems that little is done as far as pushback against these government policies.
Well, you see, when I was a young man, the United States had a homogeneous population, but there was change in 1965 to immigration laws, and we have now become a multicultural situation in which identity politics is used to separate the various components of the population and turn them against one another. So we have all the black antagonisms against whites that are increasingly expressed in stronger and stronger words. We have the sexually perverse people who are making new claims and demands for recognition and criticisms of the more normal heterosexual people, so that there's really no social unity. So there's no united people. What the United States is today is a Tower of Babel. The greatest problem that we face remains unrecognized. Again, when I was a young man, the United States was self-sufficient economically. It was short only in energy. Well, a self-sufficient economy doesn't have to worry about trade deficits. But what offshoring of American production has done from globalism, the offshoring of U.S. manufacturing to China and Asia, has made the United States import dependent, because when the offshored production of American firms are brought back to the United States to be marketed, they enter as imports. And so by offshoring our production, we guarantee that we would have forever a very large trade deficit. And so we've already touched on this situation. When the dollar ceases to be the reserve currency, there's no way to finance this trade deficit. And so what happens at that point, the US dollar simply collapses in value. Well, the worst inflations in history are caused by currency collapse. So if the dollar collapses in value, being import dependent, as the United States is, there'll be a massive rise in prices and a huge decline in real incomes. Well, if we already are afflicted with homelessness and poverty and so on, which we are, those situations will become worse. So the attention of the United States government should be on how to bring the jobs that are offshored back so that we don't create a needless and unnecessary trade deficit that sooner or later is not going to be able to be financed. So that is the real overriding problem, because if we see a collapse in the value of the dollar when we are import dependent, it means a tremendous hit to American living standards, which have been taking small hits all along the way now for some 20 years. So that's the real challenge to Washington, and you can't get anyone to acknowledge it or to mention it, because globalism has become sort of like an ideology, and people are committed to it. They think it's absolutely necessary, and so on and so on, and they've been given all sorts of false promises about it, but it's actually extremely deadly.
Right. Well, let me get Marcia in. So sorry, Paul. Let me just get Marcia in this last minute or so. Marcia, you heard what Paul just said. I mean, what we have seen in the United States when he was talking about, for example, in the 60s, and of course, a very large middle class. And now we've seen that shift, that financial shift to that 1%. That 1% or that 10% at the top, getting richer and richer as the bottom 99% and bottom 90% actually are under more pressure. But at the same time, if politicians, those who are running the country, are not willing to actually do what they need to do to improve for the average American, to improve the situation, I mean, your prognosis of where you see the United States heading to?
It's a tall order, but it's possible to make a shift. And we have no choice. Those of us, and there's people everywhere in every country that can do what's individually necessary, can make the difference, because the flip side of de-dollarization is we need a new world financial and economic framework in which we re-rev up production in a place like the United States. We still can re-regulate banks and issue credit for projects, water management out west, all that kind of thing, and respect other nations and work with them. Now, we have to counter the blackout in the United States of where this kind of development is going on. Look at China and the Central Asian 5 presidents next door to Iran just met and worked out projects. We have projects needed in North America. It may be a tall order, but this is what we have to do, because the opposite of that is chaos and global NATO war. We don't have a choice.
All right, and on that note, unfortunately, we're out of time. I appreciate both of you being with me. Paul Craig Roberts, Chairman, Institute for Political Economy, and former Assistant Secretary of U.S. Treasury out of Atlanta. And out of Washington, D.C., Marcia Baker, economic expert. Thank you both for being with us. And thank you, viewers, for staying with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi signing out for myself right here in Tehran. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.